Hey folks, this week I'm going to continue working on the cooling system swap on this project. I've already been at it for a day, this day's off, and I've got a new surge tank built. Just need to build a couple upper mounts to finish off that part of the project. Nearly all of the plumbing is complete now. Just have to get the upper mounts finished up and pour some coolant in it. Hopefully there's no leaks. Then I'll be going around and moving the wiring from the front of the chassis back to where I need it at the front of the engine, which is the back of the rig. So today I'm going to do a little machine work to build basically some turnbuckles for upper mounts. Let me show you what I got going on here. I really didn't document much of building the surge tank aside from a few photos. All of it really was just a bunch of copy and paste from what I did last week. Cut a bunch of parts out on the table. This one I had to use the press brake to bend it into shape. Weld it all together. Then this time I did powder coat this piece, and the only reason I powder coated is it looks a lot like the valve covers, so I just powder coated it to match. So now for upper radiator mounts, I need to build some threaded tubes to hook those two Heim joints together, basically make a turnbuckle. So I'll have one on that corner, then I'll have one here to here. That combined with what's down there on the lower part on that cross member, I don't think that radiator will go anywhere. New upper radiator hose. It's about 3 inches longer than the one that was in there. And then the water pump feed hose is all done. Just about ready to pour some coolant in it. But first, we'll head out to the machine room and get those turnbuckles built real quick. Take you on a little tour of the machine shop. Turn my camera the other way so I can show this a little better. It's not a very big room. It's about 12 by 14. Got an old J-head Bridgeport in here. And a late 70s Taiwanese 14 by 40 lathe. Pretty solid little unit. And my machine tools in there. And just projects and part storage there. Yeah, about anything I can do in here. As far as manual machining goes. Now for those turnbuckles. Going to be a little bit overkill for what I'm doing, but I'm going to use 5/16 Heim joints that are in there, which is way bigger than I need, but I have the stuff here to build them. This is 1/2 inch diameter, 1/8 inch wall aluminum tubing. So it makes it really easy. All I have to do is run this bit, which is only going to take like 20 thousandths out of there. Then I got a left and a right hand tap. And then for chamfering before I tap it and deburring afterwards. Get this camera set up over here on the lathe and see if I can get a little video of that. There you have it. Pretty simple. If I wanted to make them real snazzy, I could throw them in the vise here on the Bridgeport and mill some wrench flats on it, but it's not like I'm going to use them to actually try and adjust the angle of the radiator or change anything, so I don't need to turn the turnbuckles with any load on them. I can adjust them to the length that I need, lock them down, and call them good. So I'm not going to bother with the wrench flaps this time around. Time to go install. There they are, installation complete. I mentioned that I didn't need to use them as a turnbuckle or use them for any kind of an adjustment, so I didn't put wrench flats on these parts. I guess technically I didn't even need to put left-hand joints in them either. But it was good practice and they're done now. Next up is the wiring. I've got that water pump there and I've got that fan back there. And the wiring for both those components is all the way up here where they used to be up front. So it looks like I'll have to build a jumper harness of some sort. Guess I'll go dig out my wiring kit. Maybe we'll have a little tech segment in this video on what components I use for doing my wiring. When it comes time to do wiring, these are my go-to kits right here. I'll try not to spend too much time on this. Information is cool, but information is boring. So this kit right here is actually just a hodgepodge of parts that I use for my rear steer kits that I build. So it's just the necessary pins and connectors and plugs and whatnot that I have to put those kits together. There's a few oddball pieces in here that I just like to use for different projects, like these relays here. Different load amp rating relays. This is just a good place to keep that stuff. But these connectors here sometimes come in very handy for actually connecting to factory type connectors. Like I have for my rear steer kits, they use a Polac ball switch in that body, which uses this 2-pin weather pack connector. So stuff like that matching up to some of the factory switches, it just comes in handy for that stuff. Now on this side is the Deutz DT series connectors. I've had this kit, it's been depleted and refilled multiple times. I've had this kit since 2005, and you can see the different color connectors and stuff. That's just aftermarket, maybe not necessarily Deutz brand. And those come, all of this stuff I order from Waytech Wire. So primarily all of the stuff, if I have to wire it, I use Deutz stuff. It's just my preferred choice of connector. So that's what I stick with. And actually until fairly recently, I've almost solely used the DT series. And recently I've found the DTP series, which is actually rated for higher amperage. And you can see by comparing them, there's quite a difference in the size of the plug and the size of the pins. So your standard DT series is, I guess, is good for 13 amps. DTP, that one's good for 25 amps. Now there's a smaller series too called a DTM, and that is actually good for 7.5 amp. That's a smaller pin, but the plug physically isn't very much smaller, the plastic portion itself. So I've never gotten into using those. I don't spend the money on the kits or anything like that. I usually just stick to these two. You can get away with about anything you need with a DT series. If you need a little more load, then your DTP comes in real handy. Now your crimpers for the DT pins themselves, this tool here is almost as expensive as this whole kit was. You can see, got those 4 fingers in there that crimp that pin onto the wire, and you can set it for your gauge of wire that you're actually crimping the pin on. You'd either be crimping that pin onto a 22 gauge wire. You can go 26 all the way up to a 12 gauge wire. And all that does is control how tight those fingers go in and out. Set that crimp on that pin. Make sure you don't over crimp it or under crimp it. They work really good. They're just really expensive. So yeah, all of this wiring for the water pump and the fan that I'll be doing today, that will all be done with this DT kit. I pulled these plugs off of the harness that's in the chassis now, where the fan and water pump actually plugged into the truck originally. And I figured I would take a minute and show you, how easy these plugs are to work with. So they plug in really nice. They're easy to unplug, unlike some of the stuff manufacturers use nowadays. Anyway, I thought I'd just show you. These things aren't wasted. I can completely reuse this plug. Just a matter of a minute, I can have these things taken apart. Now, if I didn't need to shorten those wires, I wouldn't have even needed to cut the wires to get them off the truck. I could have just disassembled it and been done with it. This one here is a little bit more work just because it's down in the hole there, but still, same result. Just unclip the latch and comes right out of there. Now, as far as crimping these terminal ends on, I believe this is about a 16 gauge wire. So I've got my crimper set to 16 on the dial there. That's that. Really pretty simple. And they work great. There, instead of having two plugs up here, I put both hot wires for each component in one plug. That way I can just run a single 2-wire cord back to where I need the power. I'll just pick up ground back there at that end of the chassis. Running both those wires into that single plug just simplified and cleaned up this little project I got going on here. I put a mating plug onto a 2-wire SO cord and then just routed it down there with the rest of the wiring and plumbing and whatnot into that cable tray back there, the wiring tray. From there it continues on back down the chassis with the rest of the wiring back in along the engine. I'll take it around to that other side and we'll follow it on back to where I needed the power. The jumper harness continues under the back of the cab, along the transmission, right here along the engine, and just follows the main chassis harness back to this point, where I added a 4-pin Deutz connector and a mounting tab, where I'm also picking up the ground for the fan of the water pump. From here goes to 2 harnesses, one going to the water pump, and one going back to the fan. So now I can finally put coolant in this thing, cycle the water pump, test the fan, and make sure everything still works. It sounds like the water pump's working. Coolant is cycling. Looks like I didn't mess up them 2 wires after all. Guess that's about it for that project. Well, I think this is the perfect place to end this video. Next week I'll pull all the rocker arms and valve train, retorque the head studs since I haven't done that yet. Then I really have no excuse to not continue on with paint and body work. Until then, thanks for watching and have a good one.